Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Solo episode today, and I'm going to be talking about gerrymandering. So this is probably one of my favorite issues that I love to talk about. Probably the most passionate issue that I have, and really kind of what animates me, and really kind of decides which part of the party I'm on, or which party I am, and it's definitely one of the things that kind of has made me be voting a certain way on others compared to where it's been previously. Talking about gerrymandering, and if you like what we're doing in this channel, please like and subscribe, comment down below any suggestions for any other videos you want us to do, and we'll do them in the future. So, talking about gerrymandering, broadly, let's kind of talk about what and kind of how all this started, right? So, all this started. It's been going on. Gerrymandering's been going on for probably what a century or two at this point, and really kind of bringing it to today. And there's been a lot of Supreme Court cases. I'm not a legal scholar, so I'm not going to get into those. But essentially, where we kind of are now is we recently had our maps redrawn in 2020. So living in Georgia and Tennessee, obviously they were definitely big in that fight. Tennessee ended up losing a congressional district to Republicans through the cracking of the district in Nashville. Also, um, looking at the what was kind of going on in Georgia, there was a lot of kind of shenanigans about they wanted to add a district for I think it was like West Atlanta, um, and so they had to like kind of move things around to incorporate that. Obviously, I was in I think it was Congressional District 7 where it was Lucy McBath. They kind of rearranged that to be much more conservative. So then you got Rich McCormick, all these other kind of things, and it's definitely like a big issue, especially in a lot of these purple states, a lot of these states where really kind of the balance of power can go either way. North Carolina was a great example of that. Previously, tons of good material out there. The Atlas of Redistricting by 538, they do great work. And I really like it because what you can do is you can see like, hey, if we just kind of make everything um, political partisanship, how many states would get X votes. So like Tennessee would, I think, still get two, but Georgia would get like an extra one and a half or something like that. So definitely an interesting idea. And so it kind of brings us back to today. So here in 2025, President Trump obviously was like, "Hey, I want to get more congressional districts for that are going to basically be safe Republicans." And I think he either pushed Texas to get five, or he kind of wanted five districts in general. So what he did is he kind of talked to Abbott. Obviously, Abbott and Ken Paxton, all of them, they kind of were like, "Hey, we're going to redo this." Then you had the state legislature, who ultimately was going to draw the maps. They did it, and you get into a lot of that kind of stuff, which I'll be honest, I haven't really been following of whether or not. Um, the kind of the ins and the outs of, the Democratic legislature is leaving, and, I think they didn't get to see the maps at the very beginning, and it's kind of like a closed session, and then like the day of, they gave it or something like that. So a lot of that kind of stuff I don't particularly kind of follow, and more of these state specific things. But broadly, what it means is that Texas is wanting to get five safe congressional Republican seats. There's obviously some advantages. Obviously, if you read kind of where everyone's talking about with a lot of these, is you see that I think it is Texas was going to get five. I think it was maybe Missouri was going to add another safe Republican district. Ohio, I think was going to maybe add another one or two. So I think Florida might be even kind of getting in there as well. So a lot of these kind of states are kind of doing this. But broadly, what it means is that Trump is trying to kind of pad his House of Representative numbers for 2026. Now, the big political reason for all this is because he is trying to, I think they've got a two-vote margin. I think he kind of wants to have a more aggressive agenda. Honestly, and I think I've kind of predicted this, I think Republicans will probably at least maintain the majority in the Senate. I don't think Democrats are really going to kind of get anything on the Republicans on that end. and then the House is really going to be where a lot of these things are decided. So Democrats typically kind of have an advantage in the House. So this kind of reduces that advantage so that they can be more competitive, the Republicans. So now the disadvantage is that there's, you obviously have like safe Republican districts, and then you kind of have some like light red districts. So, you can move some districts from Democrat to Republican, but, going from, say, a +3, +5 Democratic seat to a +5 Republican seat, yeah, you're going to get that Republican vote, but you may lose it depending on where the headwinds go. So right now, with it being a +3 Democratic advantage on the general ballot, I believe. Maybe it's either +3 or +5. So, what that kind of essentially means is that it's kind of a toss-up. That's typically where Democrats kind of hold ground. And so what it means is that if Democrats overperform, say Gaza gets worse, Ukraine gets worse, all these other kind of things, which to be honest, I'm not thinking you're going to see a lot of that. I think it's probably going to be another toss-up. Um, Mainly because I think Trump's going to get some wins. I think as long as he doesn't get into a recession later on this year and beginning of next year, I think is what we had predicted previously. As long as he doesn't get into that, then I think he will probably have the advantage going into 2026. So now I don't know if they're going to flip a bunch of seats or anything like that in the Senate, like with down in Georgia or anything like that. Um, I think they're not running super great candidates. I got my Tennessee shirt on, but I do not support Derek Dooley. That's a side conversation, and I got to have Josh on for that one. He's definitely someone who can really talk about that. But we really kind of have to understand that you know this is really going to kind of lay the framework for not only 2026 but 2028, because they're not going to, and I think even 2020 or 2030, because they're not going to, the new maps that they draw in 2030 are not going to be passed until I think 2020, or sorry, 2032. So essentially, you kind of need to win in 2030 so that you get the census data that comes out, and then you can pass the maps for 2032. I don't think Democrats are going to be in an advantage there. I think they are they're too much fighting internally. And I think that's why, I think Trump's trying to take advantage of that with some of this redistricting. Now, that's what Republicans are doing. So now let's look at what kind of Democrats are doing. Obviously, Gavin Newsom, who's obviously eyeing for the presidency, wants to fight Donald Trump, show that he's got this fight and vigor, all that kind of good stuff. And you see a lot of other people that are kind of trying to get in there. I think Ro Khanna is another one who's been trying to fight on all that. And essentially, what that means is that he's trying to basically say, hey, if Republicans get 5 seats in Texas, we're gonna get 5 in California. So basically, kind of balance it out. And I think kind of where everything is it'll probably just end up being a wash. Now, I think the only good thing that can come out of this, of Democrats kind of fighting with the Republicans, is maybe the Supreme Court step in. Now, and I think I mentioned this on the previous 2 videos, the disadvantage of throwing it to the Supreme Court for Democrats is, even though they've typically done decently well in when things have gone there, is that, or not necessarily the Supreme Court, but district courts and things like that when it comes to gerrymandering, they've kind of, I think, ended up winning a majority of their cases. I think the one in Alabama is a good example. I think South Carolina they lost. I think Georgia was kind of like a wash. So they kind of win a few, they kind of lose a few. But I think overall they kind of come out ahead on it. The disadvantage of throwing it into the courts is that if things go all the way up to the Supreme Court, where this would be potentially going, is that it ultimately goes into a 5-4 Republican. I think maybe it's a 6-3 Republican Supreme Court. So obviously, and most of those people are going to be appointed by Trump. So you think that there's going to be a lean one way. So this is Scalia and Clarence Thomas. They're obviously going to be people who are going to vote one way um, for Trump, and then it's kind of like Comey Barrett and Kavanaugh and Gorsuch essentially are going to be the flip votes. I think Roberts probably might be one there too. Um, I'm not holding my breath on anything coming out of that. Um, and it's like I said, it's definitely going to not be an advantage for Republicans or for Democrats. It will be for Republicans. Now, that's kind of what's going on. Like I said, there's a lot of fighting, a lot of this kind of rhetoric now. Um, the issue is that a lot of this is, like I said, a lot of this is probably going to come out as a wash. But what we need to do in terms of like voters is we obviously need to kind of show up, really put pressure on them and everything like that, and not let them just kind of run up the tables. We obviously don't want, um, politicians running who's going to be in who essentially can be the politician for the voters. We want it to be the other way around. So the way that us voters are obviously going to work is we need to um, put pressure on the states or in the states and the politicians, especially at the state level, and say, hey, we're not okay with this. And so you see a lot of that kind of fighting in Texas where they're trying to get some backing and some support and everything like that, and that's great and everything. Um, Now, one thing I will say is I actually kind of called this kind of situation. So I remember, I think it's the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, run by Eric Holder. They posted a map of basically like, oh, here's where we're going to try to fight everybody. I think they put like Florida and they put like maybe South Carolina and some of these other ones. Now I even called out and I commented on that post and said, well, what about Texas? Because they didn't list Texas on that map. I think they looked at Wisconsin and some of those other ones, which would be more on the Democratic advantage. And so I said, well, what about Texas? Obviously, nobody responded or anything like that. But it was clear that Texas could be a huge momentum shift, especially for me when I think if and as a native born Texan, is that if you can start building that momentum. Okay, if you and we kind of see this in Georgia, you get some senators, maybe you get a governor, like in Kentucky, and you kind of start putting pressure on these old school Republicans, and these Democrats who typically won't turn out, or people who maybe are just voting Republican because Republicans have typically been in power. You really start providing a viable alternative, then you can start seeing some people kind of switch sides. Obviously, Texas, I think, was +5R in 2024, so that's pretty important. So now, my general thoughts of this and why I'm um, very upset with even Democrats starting to do what they're doing. First off, it's bad for democracy. Terrible thing to do. I don't support either side doing it. And to be honest, if Democrats do pursue this, um, I know the base really wants them to do that. If they do that, I probably would officially go independent. Just because I think, them doing their independent redistricting committees, that was kind of gave them the moral high ground on that. Just as, me being pro-life, or pro-choice, but predominantly pro-life, is that, um, I think that um, you do kind of want to have a little bit of that moral high ground on some of these issues, liberals with Gaza and those kind of things as well. So I think that Democrats kind of stepping away from that. Um, I think they kind of show that, hey, like we want to take this out of the hands of the legislatures. We're going to have this moral high ground, and now they're just kind of like, hey, we're going to get rid of it. I think it really kind of um, really kind of beats down on kind of what they've been doing for the past 20 years, and really shows that they're kind of going in a different direction. And I think they're becoming a lot like Republicans, and I don't think that's necessarily a good thing for them to do. Now, one of the other things is it creates more partisanship. I did mention, sometimes you can have some of these more kind of swingy districts, especially when you take some from the Democrats and you kind of move them to light red Republican. However, broadly, um, once gerrymandering is involved, you're typically carving up some of these safer seats. Now, what's interesting is that, and what I've kind of said is that, Democrats should fight the gerrymandering, especially in the South, because it really kind of starts creating more of this middle ground where you can start seeing some of these very center conservative Democrats like myself could then run for office and be successful because they're providing a cultural similarity to Republicans and then maybe a economic and policy difference from Republicans. And that's more aligned with Democrats. So you kind of have a little bit of that middle. You kind of have a lot of these kind of fusion candidates that can be successful. Now, typically, if you didn't, it was just going to be governors and senators and those kind of things. There's data to show that senators typically people just go back to, you know, party ID and everything like that. But especially for governors, where a lot of those decisions, as we see with Abbott, Kemp, and some other people, DeSantis, Newsom, governors really hold a lot of power. And so that's pretty much like the only alternative for those middle candidates, whereas you want them to be successful in, say, the House of Representatives, maybe the Senate, local legislators. Because this is the thing. So this gerrymandering issue we're talking about is really just on the national level. There are some, I think Georgia is a good example of this. I think it was Deborah Silcox. She's got a district that runs from like Roswell area in Georgia through Sandy Springs down into kind of Buckhead, and she's kind of like a more definitely basically all the Republican areas within Atlanta. So she's got that district. So gerrymandering is all the way down on the state level, as well. And you can, depending on where you're, what city and stuff, some people make claims that it's on the local level, and that's probably true as well. So it's all throughout the spectrum. So even though the big discussion is on the national level, really there's a lot of work that needs to be done, state, local, and national level for this, because when you start hollowing out the middle, it starts becoming or partisanship. Not really a great idea for anyone who wants to actually have meaningful government, compromise, and people who want to actually get stuff done, like myself. So, you know, there's also not really a great way to resolve kind of this gerrymandering stuff. So, because the states run and ultimately control the elections, um, what ends up happening is that really the kind of the only ones who can challenge that are the courts. So, obviously, courts take a long time. I think there's even still some court cases that are in litigation. Um, but typically, like a lot of these very quickly. Obviously, people don't want people wait. So people are like, hey, here's this new map. This is what we're going to do. But, if it's in 2022, they're not going to implement it because, they're going to say, well, we'll do it in 2024 in the next one. And so you kind of have a lot of, it's very hard to implement. It's very hard to kind of get resolution and static resolution. Don't have things change. You don't really want maps to be dynamic because it really just kind of shifts a lot of this, who's going to be in control of what, who's getting what resources, who's getting what political positions. That should be left to the people instead of uh, uh, political partisans deciding who's going to get what. And, when they're in power because Trump's, won in 2024, they get to decide and then it goes back to where they're not. So all in all, with what we're kind of seeing in the gerrymandering is it's not really a great um, thing. Obviously, there's a lot of people that have commented on it and a lot of people that are talking about it. But really, what I want people to understand is that not only is this one of the biggest issues for me, but this is the foundation for all the other issues that come. Why are we stuck on abortion? Well, because political partisans get to decide who gets to be in certain seats and everything like that. And so naturally, the people who fund those parties, say donors or interest groups or whatever it is, they're going to want to make sure that, hey, if I'm going to support the Republican Party, I want, or the Democratic Party, let's use them as an example, I want people who are going to be pro-choice. So you don't really have any of this middle, so they ultimately get to decide and say, hey, you know if we're going to support you, we want pro-choice candidates. So naturally the party and the politicians carve up districts so they're safe, so that they can have pro-choice candidates, and then ultimately kind of gets a feedback loop. So maybe someone as maybe another issue, trying to think would be good. Voting, like I said, you've obviously got demographic groups. So obviously Black Americans, they, you want to kind of keep them together because they can vote and really exercise their vote. Whereas if you split them apart, maybe that group who maybe has a particular opinion about Medicaid, Medicare, or reparations, whatever, maybe, you kind of get rid of that, those ideologies, those political positions. So you really kind of want to have a lot of this, um, a lot of choice in who's going to be in the House of Representatives because that's supposed to be the people's house, right? And so, with that being said, there's obviously a lot, and maybe I'll do a video on this in the future. But there really is a lot of ways our democratic process needs to be updated. Gerrymandering is obviously one of the biggest ones. You've got people talk about multi-member districts. I'm not super fan of that one, but when you look at other issues such as um, adding to the House of Representatives so you can get more people, so instead of 700,000, you've got, say, 500,000 or 400,000 people representing. So now you can double the number of seats. And so then, it's harder to kind of break people apart. There's obviously people who try to say they want to just have competitive districts. So every district's got to be competitive or more competitive, whatever it may be. So there's a lot of electoral reform and a lot of democratic reform that we need to do. Um, and gerrymandering is just one of the probably the topic ones because it really creates this power dynamic between those who have and those who don't. A lot of these other ones, say voter ID, or like I said, some of the other ones I just talked about, a lot of those maybe are a little bit more clean cut. So ultimately, gerrymandering is bad. So don't um, don't really, I say don't pick sides. Don't sit here and look at the Democrats and say, oh, look at how bad they're doing. We get to do the same thing. That's not how democracy should work. It should say, hey, you shouldn't do it and we shouldn't do it, so we're not going to do it. And we're going to put pressure on the people who ultimately decide and we're going to hold them accountable. So um, that's really all I got to say. So if you like what we're doing, if you like what we're about, obviously please like and subscribe, share the video, comment down below if you want us to do another one. And I'll see you guys in the next video. I think it'll be a great one. Thanks, everyone.